So, question for the culture. Has South African streetwear died? I ask because following September 2019 protests against gender-based violence and femicide in our country, the founders of one of the most prolific South African streetwear brands, Young and Lazy, were outed on the list. The list being the anonymous forum of accusations against, and I cannot stress this enough, alleged abusers. The allegations on the list included but were not limited to sexual harassment, assault, coercion, intimate partner violence, and rape. And the 9,000 plus accused included notable photographers, DJs, rappers, producers, musicians, influencers, promoters, stylists, graphic designers, and fashion designers, such as the founders of Young and Lazy. Following their alleged accusations, we saw a public sort of backlash against the brand, with people swearing that they would never shop from Young and Lazy again. We saw people defacing Young and Lazy products, and we even saw one person burning a Young and Lazy hoodie, which, I mean, kind of felt performative, but that's not the point. But yeah, a Young and Lazy hoodie was burned, and then the brand, which up until that point had been covered by ID, High Snobiety, The Fader, Hypebeast, they'd shown at SA Menswear Week, and they collaborated with Woolworths, Shelf Life, and Nike, just to name a few things. That brand had sort of just been wiped from existence. And it sort of felt like it had a domino effect on the rest of South African streetwear. Granted, September 2019 was only a few months before the entire world would be disrupted by the pandemic, and obviously the fashion industry has not been immune to the devastating effects of COVID-19. Lots of stores have been closed, many people have been laid off, and just generally wallets have been getting tighter and tighter. But even in the months before the pandemic became the pandemic, it just seemed like the fanfare and overwhelming hype that we saw from 2015 to 2018 around South African streetwear had already died. During that era, it really felt like it was this renaissance for South African fashion. It felt like there was a new streetwear brand every week. Like there was an almost constant stream of lookbooks, independent fashion shows, culture-focused events. You know, the coalition between liquor brands and sneaker stores and independent designers and stuff. Like it was really a very exciting time. And this is also a really big deal, considering how it's not only very difficult to establish a South African fashion brand, but it's very rare to see it reach the success that the corner store brands like Soul Soul, Tubop, Young and Lazy, along with other brands like Galaxy Boy, Lokshin Culture, Gib Gib, Head Honcho, and so on were enjoying. And then also add to that the pandemic has had a lot of people trading in their blazers and their dress shoes and occasion wear for t-shirts, sweatsuits, just general athleisure, just a greater casualization of our dress sense. This should have been a time that would at least allow a streetwear brand to survive, if not thrive. And yes, a lot of the brands that I have mentioned are still around, and it does seem like most of them are still operational. But it just sort of feels like the post-apartheid streetwear brands aren't the center of our cultural lexicon like they once were. Or at least not remotely close to the chokehold they had over the South African fashion industry from 2015 to 2018. And it would be very hopeful and naive for me to think that it's solely that the abuse allegations had carried long-term repercussions for the industry in our country. But I would like to explore a little bit of what happened. So before we get into that, let's just go over what streetwear is and what I mean when I'm speaking about post-apartheid fashion. So what is streetwear? So there isn't a single definition of streetwear. Most of the dictionary definitions will speak about how it's a casual style of dress characterized by t-shirts, athletic wear, and sneakers, and it has its origins in the surf and skate culture of the 1980s. In fact, it's actually thought that the term streetwear was first used to describe the clothes skaters wore when they were skating on the street. But obviously you can see that it is a very large combination of efforts. Streetwear, just at a glance, is the cross-pollination of hip-hop, skateboarding, and surf. Japanese street fashion, African American people in culture, basketball, Latinx culture, grunge, punk, workwear, utilitarianism, postmodernism, pop art, and most recently, the luxury sector. And what's really made streetwear so ubiquitous and disruptive beyond the drop model, the constant pop culture osmosis, and like the invention of hypebeast culture has been its ability to do the one thing so many others are struggling to do, which is to not only capture but actually hold the very fleeting and fickle attention of millennials and Generation Z. And that's why today it's estimated that 10% of the global apparel and footwear market share is just streetwear. And for context, that's over $185 billion just being held by t-shirts and track pants. So it's obviously very apparent that, streetwear is making big money and streetwear is the moment. I mean, that's why even in the past decade, we've seen this scramble for cool as everyone and anyone is trying to jump into this market. We've seen the appointments of streetwear personalities like Virgil Abloh and Kim Jones at heritage fashion houses, Louis Vuitton and Christian Dior respectively. We were all there to witness what Kanye West Yeezy had done for the idea of the celebrity streetwear line and the collaboration between hip-hop and high fashion. Even the freaking shipping and logistics company DHL has released a collection with the French luxury streetwear brand Vetements. What is it about streetwear that is so valuable to everyone? What has allowed streetwear to become the 2010s equivalent of a celebrity perfume line? I think that this can be answered through my own definition of streetwear. So to start, in 2011, Bobby Hundreds had defined the baseline for what makes a streetwear brand: t-shirts and exclusivity. And while I understand these as two very important aspects to streetwear, I think it's a little bit rigid. Streetwear is so catching not because of an aesthetic value, not because of a revolutionary product, or even really a groundbreaking business model. Yes, those aspects definitely do exist, but that's not what makes streetwear streetwear. If you look closely at these subcultures from which streetwear gets its influence, you'll see these recurring themes of anti-conformity, anti-authoritarianism, community acceptance that doesn't come at the cost of self-expression and individual freedom, and this coalition of the future and the present. In short, streetwear is the commodification of counterculture. Streetwear looks at young people and says that if you believe in A, B, and C, if you want to represent these values, if you want to co-sign a certain ideology, all you have to do in order to communicate that to the world, to your tribe, to your community, is just buying a product. And this is especially powerful because millennials and Generation Z are one of the most savvy, or the savviest consumers in history. They do not respond to being sold to. You have to connect with them as a consumer. And streetwear has basically had that in its DNA. And looking at it from that vantage point, I don't see streetwear dying anytime soon. In fact, I see it morphing and evolving, but I do think it is going to be around for a while. And since globally, even during the pandemic, streetwear has sort of still been on the up and up, it has been one of the sectors of the fashion industries that have done better during these tough times. I have to now wonder, why isn't that the case in South Africa? In my Rich Aunt aesthetic analysis, which I will link around, I spoke about the performative and transformative nature of dress for young South African women. The same can also generally be applied to people of color in South Africa. While most of us cannot have any control over our skin color, you can control your second skin, which is clothing. And the very specific and strategic manipulation of the second skin in order to transcend your position and status in society, particularly in an upward manner, is the best way I could describe post-apartheid fashion. Basically, streetwear has allowed young South Africans to buy into a global tribe, one where they're also akin or they're on the same level as professional athletes and rappers, i.e. other black people experiencing upward mobility, praise, and wealth. Of course, that isn't to say that globalization and growing American cultural dominance are the only drivers in post-1994 fashion. There are many elements of township culture, pantula, kwaito, traditional ethnic dress, and even things like dandyism as well. Going through the interviews and documentaries of high-profile streetwear brand founders, you'll see that a very big key to their success was creating a tangible, engaged community. These founders combined their local influences with their global influences in a way that served other kids like them, and it proposed the creation of their own rituals, standards of excellence, and so on. It's why Corner Store was once the place to hang out. It's why that Soul Destroy Today jacket was a highly coveted item. It's how they came to beat the odds that faced most young South African entrepreneurs in South Africa. Where did everything go wrong? So I touched on this briefly in my sustainable fashion video, also linked around. We're dropping a lot of cards today. But it does bear repeating that even with the best product or the best marketing, it is not easy to build a fashion brand in South Africa. It's a difficult task to produce quality, locally made clothing, and it's an even more difficult task to get South Africans who've been trained to value imports and international brands to part with their money. But these people did it. And you can see through the success of all the initiatives and sort of landmarks that we were building during this time, like Street Cred, like Cotton Fest, the RHTC store, the social market, the very first Experience AFI event, First Thursdays, La Familia, the House of Vans parties, Father Coffee, the Archive store, and so on. Everyone was working on building a very authentic and genuine and unique cultural hub out of Cape Town and Johannesburg, specifically Braamfontein and Johannesburg, and even Pretoria with the social market, where it was really like young people, for young people, by young people. But even with all this like social cachet that everyone is building and seeming to do all the very basic streetwear things right, everything still sort of fell off by 2019. Unfortunately, I don't have any definitive answers to exactly what happened to each business and event and initiative. And a lot of the websites, articles, and social media pages have been deleted or lost. There's also been a big flurry of scandal that has also kind of erased certain things. I'm looking at you, XAFI. And it was a bit sad because I was aware that we've lost a lot of our fashion media in the past decade, but I didn't realize how pervasive it was. It was really hard to compile any research for this video. A lot of this is going to be conjecture on my part, but these are just some things that I personally think went wrong. It's my opinion. So the first thing is too much of a focus on replication and not enough on innovation. Before the fashion timelines had split up globally to what they are now, it was the norm that in South Africa we would receive the latest trends 6 months or more later than when they had premiered overseas. This was before the see now, buy now model, and before a lot of multinational corporations like Topshop, H&M, and Zara had realized that there was money to be made or exploited in South Africa. Of course, at this time, as much as it took 6 months for things to arrive here, the internet was still instantaneous. And even if you wanted to shop online during this time, a lot of stores did not ship to South Africa. And if they did, it took way too long, it was way too expensive, and basically the only people who had access to the latest releases and the newest trends were people who were fortunate enough to travel overseas. What had made a lot of these independent local streetwear brands successful in this time was that their business model was seizing this gap in the market. So there was a lot of sneaker consignment stores or just brands where people would go overseas, shop a bunch of the stuff that was out and come back here and sell it. So basically these brands were very good at replicating the right thing at the right time once upon a time because they were able to identify a gap in the market. But I don't think too many of them had really planned beyond this point or had planned any sort of innovations or business models that was more than just being the first person to hop onto a trend. And obviously they got beat out by bigger corporations and companies that had better access to funding and distribution channels. Number 2, Clout does not pay bills. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these brands at the time were also reaching really high levels of notoriety thanks to all the features from international thought leaders in the fashion industry, like Highsnobiety, like ID, like Dazed, Hypebeast, The Fader, and so on. But I don't think any of them had really figured out how to turn all the social cachet into actual sales. But also, and this is just a generalization that I've made at looking at most local fashion brands, not just streetwear, but there is sort of a lack of good or effective business management. I think a lot of these brands are very good at their marketing and at creating hype and at, creating beautiful visuals and appearing lovely, but not really doing much or not thinking much beyond that. I think a lot of them don't consider things like having professional customer service, like having an email with your domain name on it, or responding to customers in a way that's helpful and makes the shopping experience easier. A lot of them don't have websites, and if they do have websites, they're not very good or appealing or easy to use, which also, considering how paranoid most South Africans are about internet fraud, isn't very wise. They're also not considering how they should be fostering long-term good supplier relationships, or just doing the kind of right planning, or even quality control is a big problem. I think a lot of them have products that look good but aren't actually like structurally sound, which are complaints I've seen from stylists who source from these brands. And obviously that just doesn't create repeat customers. I understand that a lot of what has made streetwear so revolutionary was that it was young kids taking t-shirts, which is one of the cheapest products to make and sell, adding really cool, interesting graphic designs and flipping that into empires now valued at over billions and billions of dollars. But in a post-2010 world, you can't just offer a graphic t-shirt in a primary color when people could very easily find something similar at a much cheaper price from a more reputable store like Mr. Price or Sports Scene and expect to compete. There has to be a greater unique selling position than just another tracksuit. I think people think that it is just enough to put a logo on a t-shirt and make $1 million. Like that's not realistic anymore. 3, the boys club. So first, I think it's very important to address that another reason why streetwear has taken off so well is because it's one of the first times in modern history that men have been allowed to participate in fashion. Hypebeast culture, sneakers, and Kanye West have finally let men have a manly forum through which they can talk about clothes and shopping. Something they've been denied so long because of how feminine fashion has been for a long time. And I think this also influences how much of a cishet boys club it's become, often leaving women and queer people out of the conversation, which is unfair considering how much women and queer people are a part of the fabric of streetwear. Like, for the fact that some of these brands would see that lots of women were buying their products, but they would still market themselves as strictly menswear. If they were opening themselves up to being more unisex or gender neutral, they were employing the pink it and shrink it model, which specifically applies to how sneaker brands will offer a feminized version of a popular sneaker to make it appealing to women in a very patronizing way. Moreover, the fact that so many notable people in the streetwear scene were outed or closely affiliated with people on the list, or kept very quiet about their affiliates being on the list, or just the list in general, also speaks to the culture of toxic masculinity present in streetwear. I mean, even of the many streetwear documentaries I had poured through to research for this video, I very rarely saw more than 2 to 3 women speaking at a time. And at that, very rarely were they women of color. And I don't even want to speak to the queer erasure that was present in those documentaries as well. It's very important that brands today sincerely and seriously consider women and queer folks. Even if it's not just from an ethical or an inclusivity standpoint, you're just also cutting yourself off from a demographic that also resonates with and enjoys streetwear. And that's just not good business sense either. I don't think that any brand that isn't inclusive of women and queer folk can survive for very long in our new climate. And I think a good example of this is how Rich Mnisi, which I don't really think is a streetwear brand, but I have seen people saying that, so for the sake of this video we will talk about that. But yeah, brands like Rich Mnisi and Art Club and Friends have inclusivity at the core of their business model, and I think that on top of offering a good product, that has helped them succeed and sort of survive the death of like local streetwear. Also another show of how marketable or sellable, you know, this approach to community and inclusivity is looking at the success of Franasonic's Nkuli tie-dye t-shirts, which sold out really well and really fast in the pandemic. So with the Franasonic Nkuli tie-dye t-shirts, I think what has made them so successful is it does what I had mentioned earlier about, you know, what's made post-apartheid fashion work, where we combine our local influences with our global influences to create a new language or new meaning. So here we have Nkuli on one hand, very popular, very notably queer influencer in our local culture. And then we take Dennis Rodman, a very iconic person in our greater global conversation, and then creating a very new meaning or a very new image and a new idea by combining these two people together. That means something very specific for us as people in South Africa. And that just kind of speaks to how like it is very possible to still be a successful South African streetwear brand right now, but like you need to move with the times. And that, I think that is my main point, the biggest tenet of fashion, which is that if it doesn't change, then it's not fashion. And I think the founders of these older brands just, perhaps maybe because they're aging out of the sort of streetwear group, or maybe they're tired, or maybe they're just dealing with the difficulties that is just trying to have a business in this economy, weren't really wising up to the times in time, basically. So definitely all that considered, might not be fair to say that streetwear has died, but definitely that the old guard is gone and that we're sort of in a second wave of our post-apartheid fashion and streetwear, and that for brands to be successful now, their legacy needs to be feminist, it needs to be queer, it needs to be concerned with the earth. So, of course, this is a very complex subject, and I've barely touched on a lot of different aspects, but I think just because I think it's a conversation for more than one day and one video. And as I had said before, we've lost so much of our fashion media, so we don't really have too much of an archive of our like South African fashion industry anymore. And basically, I'm realizing now that my question for the culture isn't what happened or has streetwear died, but my question for the culture is what's next? And that's